He is currently a special lecturer in the Department of Physiology and Cellular Biophysics at Columbia University, where he was a professor for over 40 years. During this period, he edited 12 books and published over 200 papers on the biological effects of EMF. He has worked for the Office of Naval Research as well as several industrial labs, including Unilever, and is regularly asked to be an expert witness on cases involving the effects of EMF. His book that just came out, well, I don't know when it came out, we're going to talk to him about it, is called Overpowered: What Science Tells Us About the Dangers of Cell Phone and Other Wi-Fi Age Devices. And it's amazing. Technology has come so far, and could we be doing some damage? So let's go ahead and get him on the line. Dr. Blank, thank you so much for being here. Welcome to AM 630 and the Fringe Radio Show.
Well, thank you for the invitation.
How's it? I assume you're on the East Coast?
Well, Columbia University is on the East Coast, and I'm there from time to time, but I reside in Victoria, British Columbia.
Ah, okay. Very, very good. How is your weather? Are you experiencing cold or not too bad?
No, it's actually, it's been, I don't want to jinx it in any way, but we're having a very nice summer.
Well, sounds good. It's been crazy. Today here, it felt like the first day of fall. It's amazing. Some places are getting drowned out with rain. There's drought. It's just amazing how it seems like the weather patterns and systems are kind of changing. It's all getting flipped upside down.
Yeah, well, I think that's what happens. We call it climate change. And the thing is, when it changes, you're only sure what it was. You're never quite sure where it's going, and it seems to be going in all kinds of directions.
Very, very, very true. I read your bio, which is so impressive. You've looking through just a lot of notes and talking points. How did you get into what you do? Did you have an interest in all this at a very young age?
Well, I guess I was interested in science, and that's probably what started me off on this path. The Bronx High School of Science, which you mentioned in my bio, was really the first high school that was established in New York City as a place to kind of breed specialists in science. And the thing is that it was a great experiment. And I guess Dr. Morris Meister was the one who convinced the authorities to do this. And it was a great faculty, and it was the experience was really first rate. And many of the people went on to become scientists. Not everybody. That's one of the things, that when you're in high school, you're never quite sure how you're going to turn out. In fact, that's probably true even when you're way past college, too.
Right.
You can always turn in new directions. But a lot of people just, they figured that's the future, and they loved it, and I was amongst them.
Well, very good.
Yeah.
Interesting. Well, your book, and if we could we got a lot of questions. We had a lot of students up at the University of Utah send questions in for you, Dr. Blank. Today, in today's age, everybody's walking around with a cell phone. Everybody has a tablet. We're so on the go. I mean, not that many years. I mean, the internet is really not been around that long, but the internet became, it's become so prominent in everybody's life. It's done some miraculous things. It's brought people together. It's helped advance things. I think it's done some bad things. I often preach that I think too many of these kids are texting on their phones a little bit too much. They get off of school, they come home, and right away they're on Facebook and Twitter and all these other things. It seems like a place that we all need to be parked. But, of course, your book addresses the potential, the dangers of things going on that we may not realize. You want to talk to that a little bit?
Yeah. Well, you said it's one of the things it's done is brought us all together, and I don't talk much about that in the book, but it's really something that I really should comment on, because one of the things it has done is brought a lot of people apart.
Right.
People are more interested in interacting with their machines and devices rather than with each other. And it's not unusual to walk along the street and see two people presumably walking together, each one occupied with their own device, whether it be a cell phone or tablet that they're playing with or what have you. And my wife and I were at a restaurant not too long ago, and there were two people sitting, having a meal together, and each one on the cell phone and not talking to each other.
Right.
And well, I sort of turned to one of them and said, "Pardon me, but would you mind telling me that? I mean, are you folks? This is the way you having dinner together?" And they kind of looked startled because that's the way they are having dinner together.
Right.
It's apparently a regular pattern of interaction. So the devices are terrific, but we should learn to control them rather than vice versa.
Exactly. Well, and it is interesting you said about that. Matter of fact, I was out of town for business here just the other day. I'm in the information technology world. That's what I do for a living. And I was up in Idaho at a restaurant, had an opportunity to eat at a pretty nice steakhouse. A great place, and couples sitting there with either the iPads or the cell phones, texting and again, right across from each other. And it was amazing. It wasn't one or two, Dr. Blank. It was probably out of a room of 50 people, probably 10% of them were doing that.
It's no big surprise. I think that, and the younger ones are so into it that they don't remember any other way of living, whereas the older people still remember the other way of interacting. And it was a lot of fun. I remember when you go to a seminar and there are live people around, and there's a real hot discussion going on, and it's a real back and forth, in real time. Right. And now, you get a lot of these discussions on the internet, and they too are apt to be lively, but there's an absence of immediacy. In other words, and you don't get the nuance when somebody is saying something that that's got an edge on it. So it's a different way of life, and we just have to get used to it because there are a lot of things that we're giving up in the process of getting these new advantages.
Well, let's talk about the technology because that's what your book kind of addresses and some of the talking points and some of the questions. With so many cell phones, I know now that, I remember years ago, the company I worked for, actually, I had a cell phone way back when, one of those big Gordon Gecko type cell phones. Back then, cell coverage wasn't like it is today, and now there are, you drive around, all you got to do is drive around your local area, and there are cell towers everywhere sticking up out of the ground. My understanding is that the transmission power of the cell phones of years ago, it's a lot less because, again, there's more receiving towers and relay towers. But with all this technology that we have with these tablets and cell phones and everything, what's going on? Is it taking a toll on our human existence, on our physical bodies?
The answer is yes.
Okay.
Well, we've been emphasizing in these last few minutes the social aspect, the fact that it made big changes there, and that's because people don't pay too much attention to it. But the physical aspect, I think they're paying even less attention to, because one of the things that the industry has done is to try and just make it sound like there's no problem, and that anybody who says there may be a problem is a bit, beyond the fringe, if you want to call it that.
Right.
Somebody who's not with it. And the thing is that it's gotten people confused, to put it mildly. There's a very technical area, the idea of electromagnetic fields, and although it's a fundamental force, and people ought to be able to understand at least that it's an important one. That the people don't understand how these things work, and so you hear things like power frequency, radio frequency, microwaves, and and then you hear cycles per second and hertz, and there's just too much technical stuff. And one of the problems is that the scientific aspects are getting submerged because when somebody gives you a paper with all these technical terms in it, it's hard to follow unless you're technically trained. And even many people who are technically trained are not, that familiar that they can follow what's going on. But the biologists who have made the measurements and done the experiments can tell you that there are definite indications that the cells are not happy with a lot of the stuff that's out there. And when I say they're not happy, it's not a question of a psychologist interviewing them. Cells have a way of telling you when they're not, that there's something wrong. They have something called a cellular stress response, It's a lot like what we do as organisms. As an organism, when things go bad, the body starts to secrete adrenaline, cortisol, the blood moves faster, we breathe faster. The body gets mobilized because there's something wrong, and it has to help to repair it. Well, even at the cellular level, you have a similar kind of response. It's called the cellular stress response, and it means at that point the cells start to make special group of proteins, stress proteins as they call. There are about 20 of them, and these are meant to mobilize the defenses and do what has to be done. Now, this happens with a lot of things. It happens with temperature, it happens with acidity, it happens with low oxygen. There are a whole bunch of things that trigger this thing. And wouldn't you know it, EMF triggers it as well. And the amazing thing is that it triggers it at a very, very low level. In these things, this defensive mechanism is set off in cells at levels that, people don't even consider harmful. For example, in the power frequency, when people talked about the incidence of childhood leukemia being associated with exposure to power frequency, to power lines, they talked about the problem existing at 3 to 4 milligauss. Milligauss is a certain level of intensity. Well, we can get changes that in stress proteins below that level. In other words, that there are changes that occur at about, in that range. So it means that even at that level, which is the kind of exposure which is supposed to indicate, that there is a danger level, you're getting this kind of thing setting off. And the interesting thing about the safety standards that are set up, they don't recognize this at all. The safety standards were set up largely by engineers and physicists because they don't seem to know enough biology to realize that this sort of thing is happening.
What type of damage? An individual that uses a cell phone and who consistently uses it a lot. What you're saying is that there are measurable effects that by using these devices and especially putting it right up next to your noggin, there are measurable changes.
Yes. Well, the thing that gets people focused is when they hear things like cancers.
Right.
And cancers have developed. They found that there's an increase in the risk of developing cancers of the brain for people who use cell phones, and it has to do with the number of hours they use it. And people say, well, it's a correlation. There are more people who get the cancers than other people who don't have this kind of exposure. But the thing is, the question is, this could just be chance. But the fact is that there are changes that occur at the cellular level. The reason one gets this, in the case of the stress protein, is that you get an interaction with the DNA, the hereditary material that's inside the nuclei of cells, and you get damage to this molecule. The studies were done quite a ways back. I think the first big study was in 1995 by Henry Lai, and from the University of Washington. And he and his colleague Singh published a paper showing that when you expose to EMF, both the power frequency and at radio frequency, you find that you can get damage to the DNA. When you start to move the DNA in solution in an electric field, you don't get only the clump of DNA that would exist in, let's say, like an extract from the nucleus, but you get little bits and pieces of the DNA coming off. And that shows that this kind of radiation will cause the damage to that molecule. And, of course, this damage shows up as mutations. And mutations are believed to be the step on the road to developing cancers. So you can put two and two together and say that not only is there a correlation, but there's a reasonable mechanism that one can think of that would work this way.
What? Let me put some questions out to you, Dr. Blank. One of them is it says, what are some everyday use items that we use that can cause EMF radiation, and what are the high risk items such as cell phones, stuff in our car? Of course, there's Wi-Fi signals in the air, flying through the air at 802, 811 megahertz. Is a cell phone going to cause more damage than your wireless internet?
These are questions that we'd all like to know the answers to, but the fact is that nobody really knows the answers, and in fact nobody knows really what questions to ask, because it's really a totally unknown area as to what damage leads to what kind of problem biologically. It's trying. I don't know how. Well, I'm trying to think of what might be a good way to explain the kinds of things that can happen. But the damage is done to the DNA molecule, and the damage can be repaired by people when they sleep usually. And one of the interesting things that's been found with the EMF exposure is that a consequence of exposure to EMF is the shutting off of melatonin secretion. Melatonin is an enzyme that's secreted by the pineal gland in the brain when one goes to sleep, and it helps the body sleep, and that's the time when you've got repair processes going on.
Okay.
Well, when you're exposed to EMF, it interferes with the secretion of melatonin, which means that it's interfering with these repair processes. And that's almost as if a kind of a double whammy. Not only are you getting the damage that's being done by this exposure to EMF, but you're getting also interference with a mechanism that is apt to repair the damage. That's it. That's really one of the important messages that I think people can walk away with from what we're talking about. Damage seems to be what happens when you're exposed to this kind of stuff. We're exposed to EMF radiation from ultraviolet, for example, which damages cells in the skin.
Right.
And we know that can lead to, melanoma. And the fact is that, but the body repairs a lot of these things. So not everybody who gets exposed gets the disease. So repair is a very important thing. You've got two things working for you. One is to minimize the exposure, and the other is to maximize the repair. And the way you can maximize the repair is to live, like a champion, eat well, sleep well, rest well, exercise well. In other words, good healthy living will help the repair processes, because the fact is that living in today's world, you are going to be exposed to this kind of radiation pretty much everywhere you are, because it's really all around us. You go into your kitchen, you will get it from the appliances in there, including the one which is will have a different range. I didn't talk about the various ranges of EMF. There are different frequencies, and the different frequencies have different characteristics according to the way we look at them. But the fact of the matter is that the whole spectrum is a continuum. All the divisions that are made between power frequency and radio frequency and microwave, these are man-made divisions. They're artificial. And the fact is that all these things are on a continuum. So when I talked about stress proteins earlier, that these are signals by the cells that they react to damage that is caused by exposure to EMF, the fact is that you get these stress proteins across the non-ionizing spectrum, across these this whole frequency range that is people are getting very worried about. So it's hard to grasp that it's a whole bunch of things that we are throwing at people now.
Right.
It's hard to imagine that if you lived about 150 years ago, the environment had virtually none of this non-ionizing radiation in it. We had some from the sun. The sun has a very broad spectrum. In addition to the light that we see that comes from the sun, we know about the ultraviolet and the infrared, but it also has radiation that's coming at even lower frequencies. And so we had some from the sun, and then we also had some radiation, very, very low frequency, that came from lightning storms that occurred around the Earth. We have, whenever we have a storm and there's lightning, electric shocks come and they resonate around the Earth through the ionosphere. That's the layer of atmosphere that can conduct electrical signals. So that this was all we had. And then we had the light bulb, and then powerhouses, and then power lines, and it's just gotten more and more of this stuff all over the place. And now it's just that you can't find a place where you don't get something like that. I'm joking, but I mean it's pretty crowded, and it may be full.
We're bombarded by it. One thing interesting in your talking points here, and we got a lot of questions sent in, but they're all kind of intermingled together. One talking point is cell phones and why the consumer should have the right to know exactly what they are buying. I would assume that if we want to throw a little bit of government and political stuff in with it, which I usually don't do, but let's be realistic, Dr. Blank. Today, technology is where it is. Everybody wants the latest and greatest cell phone. They all want the latest and greatest tablets and computers, and we want the highest download speeds and upload speeds. I would assume that, and maybe you could talk a little to this, that as far as the government stepping in making, how can I put it in a nice way, making too much of a big deal of this type of thing would probably affect the economy. There would be an economic challenge or an economic bounce back if too much of this talk kind of got out.
Well, I don't know what to say. I think government has many functions, and among them is the need to protect the population. I mean, we certainly exercise that in a military way when we see threats overseas. We even go so far as to send our army over there too. Well, we have threats at home, and the thing is that when something happens that could endanger the population, the government usually does something about it. The problem with the EMF issue is that it's almost the people who are getting these products out. I guess they had to. It was a big gamble, and they had to make sure that they weren't being too exposed. So they made sure that the government couldn't interfere much, and so they really limited the ability of the government to step in. And the one thing that they did limit was the ability to step in terms of health reasons. You'd never know why they did that. I guess it was well known that that there were health aspects associated with exposure to EMF. The legislation that was responsible for this occurred during the Clinton administration, which was, I guess, in the 90s. And the thing is that people knew, for example, back in World War II, that exposure to radar, for example, caused problems in many of the operators. And there were well-known effects that were described by one of the engineers who worked on this radar. He described an ability to interact with the ear, the apparatus of the ear. There's a special click that was associated with microwave click or something, microwave hearing. And the other thing was even more devastating is that something called the breach of the blood-brain barrier. The brain is, it's in the cranium, which is a bone, but it doesn't smack up against the bone. Mm-hmm. It's surrounded by a layer of fluid called the cerebrospinal fluid, and that fluid is kept pristine. It is very carefully regulated by the cells that enclose it. And what happens is when you're exposed to radar or microwaves, it leaks. This barrier that keeps the cerebrospinal fluid clean allow stuff to leak in, and it leads to damage, and some of the cells actually die. And then in the recent experiments, they've shown that cells die as a result of this kind of leakage. So this was known back in I think the first paper that we saw in English was in 1970. So when they started the whole business of manufacturing these things, somehow this was, judged to be irrelevant or was suppressed, and nobody really talked about it until it became a problem. And the problem was when there was a paper that was came out about the fact that power lines, which were, very low frequency, it's about 60 hertz is the lines that we have in our houses, but maybe the distribution lines that we have in neighborhoods, or maybe 30,000 volts or something like that. But the power lines were maybe a couple 100,000 or something like that. That they were associated with the incidence of leukemia in children. So very, very low exposures to this kind of radiation. And I call it radiation, but I think it's technically one would not really refer to such low frequency as radiation, but we'll let that pass. But that exposure to that led to an incidence of leukemia. And the level at which it occurred was relatively low. It was at 3 to 4 milligauss, which is really not very much higher than what one finds inside in the houses that could result from the wiring inside the walls. And it's that's when the issue broke. And then the Paul Brodeur, a reporter for, I think he wrote it in the, well, I'm not sure now, but that he had a series of articles that came out that drew attention to this, and then the issue kind of exploded. And there were people raising their voices on both sides of the argument, but the fact is that the regulatory agencies did not step in and do anything. Right. Because they had been stopped by the legislation that allowed this to go, because it was not supposed to. This industrial development was not supposed to be impeded by health issues. I mean, you get all kinds of other things, but not health issues. People must have suspected that there was a problem, and they fixed it. And now the problem is that you don't get adequate, what shall I say? It's not adequate, responsibility, or
right.
The people who set up the accountability, the people who make these regulations are really not qualified. Either that, or they are, well, I don't want to use bad words on this, but they're, I would say, basically not qualified. I mean, the Canada recently had a review of what they call Safety Code 6, which deals with radio frequency microwave and many of these devices now. And they basically said, well, let's keep things the way they are. That we need more information. They don't need more information. They need a little bit of fundamental learning, because a lot of the information has been available. But these guys don't read the biology. They don't know, well, they don't want to know the biology. Maybe they're a little afraid of it.
Yeah, and what it could do. Well, that's what I'm saying. It's just the responsibility. Again, I can really see here where, again, with technology moving where it is and the kind of money that these companies are making, it's I think people should be a little bit aware of things. One thing, if I could digress just a little bit, sometimes I think the general person, I've been a ham radio operator for 40 plus years. I'm an experimenter. I like working with communication in the microwave bands and the VHF bands, and I've built big amplifiers, and I have an unbelievable respect for all of this. And I think a lot of times people, they don't realize with some things in our homes, some things that we have in our house can be somewhat dangerous, like a microwave. I remember years ago when I lived in Chicago, I used to go to this restaurant, and they had a row of those old big stainless steel microwaves. And the gentleman that owned the restaurant, he had a lot of his cooks and helpers. They had the latch, the safety latch, disabled, so they could get the food in and out of the microwaves as quickly as possible. And I remember reading an article in the paper not many years after the restaurant closed. A lot of those workers lost a lot of mobility in their right hand from opening up those microwaves that weren't fully shut off, sticking their hand in and grabbing the plates of food out. It's amazing if you take a look at the damage that some of this stuff can do. It would give people a little bit different. You know, they need to respect things a little bit more and maybe think a little bit more about some of the things that they do, especially talking on these cell phones morning, noon, and night, and just kind of take a look at some things. And you know, there's a lot of good things out there, but things need to be done in moderation and take a little safety into mind.
Yes, you have to realize what you're dealing with. It's like you know, when man first got in contact with fire. It's great to cook food, but the fact is that if you're not careful, you can burn yourself real badly.
Exactly.
And I always tell people that, and it's amazing how many people don't realize this, that when they have their cell phones, not to put it in their pocket unless they shut it off. One of the things that's happened is men tend to slip their cell phone in the pocket. They don't shut it off lest they get a call, and they want to catch that call as soon as it comes in. And the fact of the matter is there have been several papers showing that there's a decrease in sperm count in many people, depending on kind of the exposure. There are ways of measuring this thing, but there are a number of papers that really have shown there's a correlation between exposure to cell phone and these fertility problems, like decreased sperm count, bad sperm, like the tails get distorted so that they can't, move adequately. So that's one of the things you got to realize, that if it's bad, you just limit it. And if you want to put it away and you're not using it, shut it off. And when you want to find out if you have a call, take it out and then turn it on and see whether you've gotten any calls. The other thing is people don't realize that if they've got Wi-Fi in their houses, that you shut it off when you're not using it. There's no reason to have it on when you don't need it. And many people just sleep through the night with this thing in there. Why? So if you become more conscious of what we're living with, then you can behave more intelligently and more safely. It's a lot like driving. Driving is not safe. You know, we have, 30,000 fatalities? I don't remember what the number is, the latest number is. But in the U.S., there are a large number of fatalities every year from driving. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't drive. We've got cars. But the thing is, we've got speed limits. We've got seat belts. We've got power brakes. We've got all kinds of things that we put in to make sure that we minimize the damage if we ever get into a situation where there's a bad crash or something that goes wrong with the car. So it's the same thing. People haven't gotten to the point yet where they realize they've got to do something about it. And if people don't, at least the government should realize this. That's the point. We elect these guys to take care of us. Well, not like a mother taking care of a child, but to be responsible for issues that we may not be tuned into. It's their job to be tuned into these issues and to respond appropriately.
A question that comes in for you, Dr. Blank, is it says, Dr. Blank, do you think that one day we may have video that will be able to see electromagnetic spectrum, allowing us to see some very interesting things?
I'm not quite sure, but I'm sure what I can say generally is anytime there's a new technology that opens up something that we didn't have before, it's usually a source of interesting information. So I would give a qualified yes, because I don't really know. I guess he probably doesn't know either, because it's the kind of thing that you're imagining what might happen. But by and large, all of these advances have led to led to increases and very often surprises.
Interesting, very interesting. Another question is, what are some of the caller writes in? It says, what are some of the listener rather writes in says, what are some of the diseases that are related to EMF? Should EMF be considered a carcinogen?
I would say the answer to that has already been given in part by the World Health Organization. They in 2001, I think it was, they said that power frequency is a possible carcinogen. And in 2011, they said that radio frequency is a possible carcinogen. And there are a number of studies that they use to back up this idea, because the fact is that people have seen exposure to this kind of radiation has been linked with the incidence of cancer. There's one interesting study about cancer of the salivary glands. Salivary glands, as you know, are in the mouth, and they secrete saliva. Yes. when you eat to start a digestion, and they found that there is an increase in the salivary in the cancers of the parotid gland, which is one of the salivary glands in the mouth, that correlate with the use of cell phones. But the same studies have found there's no increase in cancer of the submandibular gland, which is below the mandible, below the jawbone, and is therefore shielded by the bone, so it doesn't get the same radiation when you're using a cell phone. So it's almost as if these studies show that it's correlated with the use of cell phone, and if you get less of the radiation, you get less of a bad effect. So that I thought was a very interesting result that one gets.
Exactly.
Yeah, there was another study that was done quite a few years ago about the exposure in San Francisco, the exposure of people who live close to the Sutro Tower, which has all the AM, FM, TV, UHF, all the antennas on there, and they broadcast this information through a good part of San Francisco. So Neil Cherry, who's from New Zealand, and he died a number of years ago, actually went through the data that one has about the incidence of cancer on residents around that antenna, and over a 50-year period. So he got this is real solid data that he didn't collect, but was really in the archives, and was able to take out and show that there was a correlation with the distance from this radiating tower. And it fell off, sort of like a nice smooth curve that you might expect. The interesting thing is that when you were 2 miles away, he measured the radiation, and he measured the radiation at different points all over that field. And at 2 miles away, the incidence was something of 5 or 6 times greater risk than if you didn't live in the vicinity of the towers at all. So, but he measured not only the risk, but found what the actual field was, and the field was 1,000 times lower than what is listed as being safe today.
Really?
So I think that is a kind of a pretty good indication that the safety standards that exist today are really not safety standards at all. They're fictions that have been put in so that the public can think that there's something there, and the fact is that the data don't they don't bear that out. That kind of result has recently been shown in a study that was done in Brazil, and this is a modern study in a modern city with the cell phone towers, and they measured it in the different strengths in different parts of the city, and they found a similar kind of curve. The numbers are different, but the other thing that's a little scary is that over the period of the study, I think it was something like 5 or 8 years, they found there was an enormous increase in the level of radiation in the area because people are using these devices more and more, and that's becoming the norm. In other words, we're going to be living with all this with this exposure.
What about a question that came in for you, Dr. Blank, was artificial EMF. Has there been any scientific, maybe I shouldn't say scientific study, but maybe any research to see that if it actually has an effect on our mental and emotional state above and beyond the physical effects?
Well, what do you mean by artificial EMF? You mean
well, like our cell phone, our cell phones and what have you. Of course, it's measurable with changes in the body. But what about mental or mental effects or emotional effects at all? Do you think it could? I think the question is, do you think can that affect our emotional state or our mental state?
There are studies about that show that people living in these kinds of environments have some of these kind of nervous, what you might call psychological symptoms. I don't doubt that can happen. One of it would influence the function of cells everywhere, and I guess if it influences the cells in the brain, you might very well be causing these kinds of reactions. I would say it certainly is possible, and that many of the things that have been described as psychological symptoms may very well arise from these kinds of perturbations.
Right, which could be a derivative of, again, of an actual physical change.
Well, it is a physical change. I mean, one of the things about an electromagnetic field, this is a fundamental force of nature. You know, like gravity. Gravity means that all these bodies are attracted to each other. That's why we fall down. We don't fall up because we're attracted to the earth. It's a huge mass. Well, electrical signals and magnetic signals affect charges, and we're all made of charges. We have protons and electrons, and these are charges, and these are influenced by these fields. We did a number of studies on electrons moving in biological processes and found that they are influenced by the relatively weak fields because, we studied electron transfer in enzymes. We used a cytochrome oxidase, which is an enzyme in mitochondria that makes the ATP, the fuel that really is needed for lots of processes in the body. And, you can influence the way it functions by, with these fields. We accelerated the rate at which these things work. And so I have no doubt in my mind that you can influence, that these fields have an influence. We know that these fields can influence the movements of electrons in DNA. And that's probably what accounts for the stimulation of the DNA to start making stress proteins, or the stimulation of DNA that causes damage, that leads to mutations. The electrons are in the DNA structure. If you think of the DNA, this double helix, that is two chains that are interconnected, and you kind of twist them around so that they have this, but basically it's like two chains that are interconnected, and on both sides think of it as a kind of like a flat tape that's been twisted. If you take the tape part, both surfaces of the tape have electrons on them. These are electrons that are known as pi electrons. They are relatively delocalized. They're not the electrons that are used for bonding, that make strong bonds, but they kind of float around in a wider space, and they can move. And there's a group at Caltech that Jacqueline Barton and her group, they have published many papers on that, showing that you can actually get these electrons to move with externally applied fields, or generating an electron at one place and having it move to another place along the DNA. So it's not surprising that you get these kinds of reactions. that's, as I would say, it's natural and expected.
Right. One last question for you. It said, are there any statistics that show health impacts, potentially cancer cases, among people that are in the cellular phone business, especially cell phone tower erectors and maintenance type people?
Yes, there are studies that have shown that. I don't have them at my fingertips, but there have been studies that have shown that the people who are involved in the industry, the line repairmen, for example, I think have statistics that indicate a higher rate of different diseases. It's not surprising that this happens. It certainly has been found with sewing machine operators. These have some very powerful power frequency range of fields, and when you work with a sewing machine, you have to be real close, and you're subjected to these kinds of fields, and there are statistics that show that a greater incidence of medical problems. But by the same token, these are powerful fields, and they can be used to do good things as well. And one of the things that's been shown is that you can stimulate cells in certain ways. For example, one of the earliest things was a colleague of mine at Columbia University, Dr. Bassett, Andy Bassett, developed a way of stimulating bones that were broken and didn't heal properly, the so-called pseudoarthroses. In other words, the bones form a callus rather than a joint. And he was able to get those kinds of fractures to actually join, I think, in a very high percentage of cases. I think they were close to 90% of them, by stimulating them with an appropriate signal. So the same way in which you can influence things negatively or cause harm, those same processes can sometimes be put to use where you actually get an improvement in the situation. So you can utilize these forces for good as well as for evil. I mean, not evil, but for bad.
For bad, right.
Yeah. The thing is that you've got there's one study that I was associated with that was published by the first author was George, who found that when you're dealing with systems that you want to prevent problems later on, you first treat the patient with enough electromagnetic fields to stimulate the buildup of these stress proteins, which turn out to be protective when you then put a bad stimulus on that you know is going to cause some harm. And this is in transplants. In other words, when you want to make sure that the person will be in a not only receptive, but will be able to have a defensive stance.
An immunity.
It's not quite immunity, but it gives you a kind of a leg up when you're trying to do something new and perhaps slightly not dangerous, but taxing on the body.
Exactly. Dr. Blank, where can our listeners, where can they get your book at?
I believe it's available in online and Amazon and certainly various bookstores. As far as I know, it should be available everywhere. And if you don't find it, I guess you can always call 7 Stories. That's the small publisher. I believe they're part of Random House, but the publisher is called 7 Stories. And you can always get them, and I'm sure they'll like to sell it to you. That's what they do for a living.
Gotcha.
They actually pride themselves on putting out sort of books that have a message. Let's put it that way. They try and get people to pay attention to something that has been, if not overlooked, at least not given sufficient attention.
Gotcha. Dr. Blank, I want to thank you so much for being here tonight. It was an honor to have you on. His book called Overpowered, What Science Tells Us About the Dangers of Cell Phones and Other Wi-Fi Age Devices. Thank you for giving up some time on your Saturday night. Have a great weekend. And again, it was an honor to have you here and talk about these things.
Well, thank you for the invitation, and I hope that people have learned something from this.
I sure have. Take care and enjoy.
Oh, you too.
Okay, my
Good night.
friend. Good night. Thank you.